Go to the page Yud Zayin in this. Yud Zayin in here. Okay. I'll try to do it outside, but just follow along as well. You'll see where I am. So the Torah begins this week by saying Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim for 17 years. And the question is, why does the Torah say the number of years that Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim? In the previous parsha, it says he was 130 years when he got there. It says he was 147 when he passes away. So if he gets there at 130, passes away at 147, do the math. It's 17 years in Mitzrayim. Even if I wrote the calculator. So, and if the Torah does want to tell us the amount of years that he lived in Mitzrayim, so then it's not necessary to tell us how old he was when he passed away. If you say he was 17 years in Mitzrayim, he got there at 130, we know at 147 he passed away. So either, what's the point of saying he got there at 130, he passes away at 147, it comes out, it's 17 years in Mitzrayim. We could do that, it comes out that it was 17 years in Mitzrayim. So the Torah calls this parsha Vayechi. It begins with the word Vayechi, he's alive, and the commentaries say that the years he lived until he got to Mitzrayim weren't really Vayechi, weren't really alive. He's full of pain his whole life. Problem with Dinah, problem with Esau, problem with Lavan, and Yosef's sale. And only now, when he's now with Yosef in Mitzrayim, does he finally have a time of tranquility and peace. So only now can we say that Yaakov is alive. But the Torah doesn't just describe the years he's in Mitzrayim. The Torah also says he lived for 147 years. Why? Because you might think that, okay, so he had 130 hard years and 17 good years. So the Torah summarizes his life by saying he had 147 years and puts together the 17 years at the end with 130 hard years in the beginning to say that the years at the end sort of equalized his entire life so that we could say about his whole life that it was good. He had such a good ending of his life that it made, for Yaakov's perspective, to feel that I had lived a good life. His last 17 years made the whole life feel to him as good. Makes you think about elder care and the way people at the end of their life that those years are really important. Anyways, but the question we have is like this. Okay, so the last 17 years of his life were good and made him feel that they were good, but it's not just the way he felt about it. The Torah is the Torah of truth, and the Torah is saying you should know there was 147 years of Yaakov's life. They're all the same. How can you say they're all the same? 130 of them are very difficult. They're the opposite of good. And only the last 17 are good. In his feeling, okay, that's nice. But how can you say that you can say it made Yaakov forget about his pain? All right. But it's not just forgetting about his pain. The Torah summarizes his whole life and says he had a good life. It's all was good. You can't say it's all good. It wasn't all good. So understand this by looking at the Rashi in the beginning of this sixth parsha. Rashi says at the beginning of the sixth parsha that this parsha is stuma. Stuma means that usually whenever Torah begins a new Torah portion, there's a bit of a separation between this portion and the portion before. So Rashi quotes a Medrash. The Medrash actually gives three reasons why we don't have this separation. Medrash says that Rashi only brings two of these explanations, but the Medrash has three. One reason is once Yaakov passes away, the slavery begins, and so the eyes and hearts of the Jewish people became closed. The name of a Torah portion that is juxtaposed to the portion before is stuma. If there's a space, it's called open. If there's no space, it's called closed. So it's a closed Torah portion because after Yaakov passes away, everyone's hearts and eyes are closed. Another reason why it's closed is because Yaakov is closed up from the information of the coming of Mashiach. Hashem first wanted to tell him the time of the coming of Mashiach. And the listeners listened yesterday about how Yaakov still remembered and didn't forget Anyways, I just want to advertise. You have to listen to yesterday's shir. I never give advertisement yesterday's shir, but yet the mimer we learned is just unbelievable. Chaim.
But here, it's the morning.
Huh?
The morning shir?
The morning shir, yeah, yes, the morning. Unbelievable. And anyway, so the second explanation is why is it closed? Because for Yaakov, Hashem closed from him. Hashem closed away the time of the coming Mashiach. Yaakov first knew it, then Hashem closed it away. He couldn't know it anymore, so it was closed. The third explanation why it's called closed is because all pain in the world was closed away from Yaakov. Yaakov no longer had any pain. So that's the three explanations that the Medrash brings. And the Medrash is addressing why this Torah portion is juxtaposed in the Torah without any space at all. That's what the Medrash is addressing. The question is like this. The first words of this Torah portion are Yaakov is alive. It's a very positive thing. So the positive explanation of the Medrash, so Yaakov had no longer pain, all pain in the world was closed away from him. That should have been the Medrash's first explanation. And the question is even more because since the Torah physically puts together the first verse of this portion with the last verse of last week's portion by Yigash ends with Jewish people are living in Egypt and they are in the best part of the land. And it would make sense to continue with, and there's no longer pain, and they're in Egypt, and Yaakov is living there, and there's all pain in the world is now closed away from him. That would be a very natural flow. But the Medrash apparently dislikes its third explanation, and therefore places it in a class C. We don't want to really say this one. Okay, I'll give you a third explanation too. Why is this explanation number 3 when this explanation really fits very well with the end of last week's Torah portion and makes a flow of the end of last week's Torah portion with Jewish people's abundant success in the land of Egypt, and then continuing on, Yaakov lives and there's no more pain. There's a bigger question in Rashi. Rashi not only brings this explanation number 3, Rashi omits the whole third explanation in the Medrash. Rashi takes the whole third explanation out. Why is it the whole third explanation out? The third explanation seems to fit the most with the simple meaning of the Torah. This one really fits in with trying to put together this Torah portion with the one before. And yet Rashi omits the third explanation completely. Rashi brings 2 other explanations. We need to understand also the order that Rashi brings the 2 other explanations. Rashi's first explanation is that after Yaakov passes away, it's very difficult for the Jewish people in Egypt. Their hearts and eyes are closed. That's explanation he brings first. So it's a negative explanation. It doesn't have anything to do with Vayechi and being alive. His second explanation is that Yaakov wanted to tell his children the time of the coming Mashiach, and Hashem hid that from him. So that at least happened in his lifetime. So that fits with Vayechi a little more. That's a little bit, at least he's alive during that time. But Rashi brings the first explanation first and the second explanation second, when it will make more sense, it would seem, for Rashi to say that the reason this parsha is closed is because Hashem hid this information from Yaakov. At least that explanation happens in Yaakov's lifetime, happens during the Vayechi, during Yaakov's life. So, understand this. Understand the questions? Not really.
The questions, you mean the reasons?
The reasons.
The explanations.
Sure. Well, the 3 reasons Rashi says, 2 reasons Rashi says, 3 the Medrash says, and it seems like the order of the Medrash is completely the opposite of the way it should be.
Right.
The third explanation should be first, the second explanation should be second, and third should be third. Sorry.
The first
should be third, second, thank you. It should be the exact opposite order, and Rashi omits the third explanation, even though that seems to be the best one. Third explanation, again, is all pain is now removed from Yaakov. That seems to fit very well with the flow of last week's Torah portion. The second best explanation is that Yaakov wanted to tell his children the time of the coming Mashiach, and that was hidden from him. So at least Yaakov is alive in that part. But Rashi brings us his very first explanation. You know why this Torah portion is closed? Because after Yaakov passes away, the hearts and eyes of the Jewish people are closed. That's something that happens after he passes away. It's very different to the meaning of the first verse of the Torah portion. Yaakov lives in Mitzrayim. So we'll understand this by first looking at another question the commentaries ask. If the reason the Torah puts this Torah portion in proximity with the portion before and closes it, if the reason is in order to tell us that Yaakov didn't know the time of the coming of Mashiach, Hashem hid that from him, that the Torah portion is closed because Hashem closed off information from Yaakov. If that's the reason, then the place that the Torah should put the closed portion should be in the yesterday's chitas. Yesterday's portion of Chumash, where Yaakov gathers his children together, that Torah portion should be closed. Why is the very beginning of the parsha closed? So the reason why a Torah portion is closed at the very beginning of the Torah portion, instead of being closed in the middle, is because you want to highlight something. You want to highlight that usually at the beginning of every Torah portion, there's a space. And so even though it would make more sense to put the juxtaposition, to close it off in proximity to the verse which talks about the Yaakov wanting to relate to his children, time to come Mashiach, even though that would fit in more with the message, but it wouldn't be so noticeable. If that Torah portion is a closed portion, there are many closed portions within every Torah portion. But the beginning of a Torah portion is always open. There's always a space there. And therefore, the very beginning of the Torah portion has to be closed to give us any message. Because you wouldn't notice a message if by the Torah closing off the verse about Yaakov wanting to tell us the time of the coming Mashiach. However, because the Torah does say this at the beginning of the portion, it makes more sense to say that there's a general message out this Torah portion instead of saying it has to do with one specific verse. And since the majority of this week's Torah portion does not talk about Yaakov's life, rather it talks about events that happened after his passing, so it makes sense to say that what does it talk about in this week's Torah portion? It talks about in Parshas Vayechi, it ends off with how Yaakov and his children are living in Egypt. But this Torah portion talk about his passing, before he passes away, his passing itself, what happens after his passing, the blessing he gives before his passing. It's all about his dying. So, right at the beginning of the Torah portion, very first verse, we have a summary of the life of Yaakov. So it makes sense to say that it makes more sense to say that the fact that Torah closes off its beginning and doesn't make that space there, at stuma, makes more sense to say that the reason why it's stuma is in order to portray something, to tell us something about the general theme of the Torah portion, which is not Yaakov's life in Egypt. The general theme of the Torah portion is Yaakov's passing. So it makes more sense to say that the fact that it's closed, the fact that there's no space there, is not about a specific event that happened in the very first verse of the Torah portion. Rather, it makes more sense to say that it's giving us a general message about Parshas Vayechi. So this answers the two questions we had before. We had a question, how come Rashi skips the third explanation? The third explanation is so positive, so levitic. Yaakov has no pain left in the world. That's the third explanation. Rashi skips that. The Medrash brings it as number 3. Why don't we bring that in? So based upon our explanation, it makes a lot of sense. Why? The fact that Yaakov doesn't have any pain, when did that begin? That began as soon as he arrived in Egypt. It's not about his passing, it's about his time in Egypt. Whereas the theme of the Torah portion is about Yaakov's passing. So to say that the whole Torah portion is a stuma, the whole Torah portion is called closed, because Yaakov had his best years in Egypt and the troubles of the world were closed away from him, to say that would mean that the theme of the Torah portion is about Yaakov's life and where his best years were. That's not the theme of the Torah portion. The theme of the Torah portion is Yaakov's passing. And then that's the theme of the Torah portion is passing. So saying that the whole Torah portion is closed to tell us about that the troubles of Egypt were closed away from him doesn't make sense. And it also answers our question in Rashi. We asked, how come Rashi brings his first explanation first and a second explanation second. What's his first explanation? His first explanation was, anyone remember?
His first explanation for clothes.
Yeah.
Rashi's?
Yep.
It was because they closed the eye. It was closing his mind.
The mind, the eyes, and the heart, the Jewish people were closed after Yaakov passed away, because that's when the slavery begins. But that makes sense why it's the first explanation. It's talking about after Yaakov's passing. What happens because Yaakov passes away is difficulty. The slavery, it's hard, it's not easy.
Right.
So it makes sense that that's the very first explanation Rashi brings, because that's in sync with the theme of this Torah portion, the passing of Yaakov. Yaakov passes away and it gets hard.
The others would pertain only to Yaakov. The next one pertains to him, his mind being closed.
The next explanation is that before Yaakov passed away, he gave a lesson to his children, which is also about his passing. It's also about his passing. So that could be explanation number 2. But the third explanation that the Medrash brings, Rashi skips completely, because the third explanation is about Yaakov's life in Egypt. And the theme of the Torah portion is not about his life in Egypt. The third explanation is about Yaakov's, third explanation is about the Torah portion, not about his life in Egypt. The Torah portion is about his passing. Okay, so we've explained Rashi. But Yonatan Malger is saying this explanation of Chassidus, this is a Chassidus class. So where's this old Nigla? Where's the Chassidus? Let's go to page Utes Hey. Let's see the Chassidus. Chassidus always goes deeper. Chassidus isn't satisfied with things that just make sense, explain the verses. Chassidus is like lahavdil, like a consultant. You go tell a consultant, you have a business, you're selling apples, and you're telling how you're selling and what's going on. Says, what are you trying to do here in the first place? So it says, where are you going? What is Parshas Vayechi meant to be about? Don't tell me what it talks about. What is it meant to be about? If indeed the whole Torah portion talks about Yaakov's passing, so why is it called Vayechi? Why is it called Yaakov being alive? The whole Torah portion talks about Yaakov's passing, events connected to his passing. So why is it called Yaakov being alive? The end of the first verse of the Torah portion, and Yaakov lived in Egypt for 147 years. That makes sense how that's connected to Yaakov's passing. It's the number of years he lived in the world. But the beginning of that verse, Yaakov lives in Egypt, what does that have to do with his passing? What the Torah should have done is like this. Next page. What should have happened is the first words of this week's Torah portion should have been in last week. Yaakov lived in Egypt for 17 years. The Jews were in Goshen. They had a great time there. They were in the best part of the land. And Yaakov lived there for 17 years. In the same Torah portion where it says that the spirit of Yaakov is revived, the Torah should put him there, add another half a verse there and say, Yaakov lived there for 17 years. And then begin in this week's Torah portion, Yaakov's life was 147 years. Besides that, as we've said many times, this is the Rebbe's chiddush in a way. The Rebbe devotes so many talks to understanding the name of the parsha. There must be a connection between the name of the parsha and the content of the parsha. Kate said, how can a Torah portion be called Vayechi and he was alive and the whole thing is about his passing? Why is it called being alive? It's
because he lives.
Let's see. You've been pickled in Hasidic Jews, so you're saying, what's the question? What is life anyways? Let's see inside. Explanation. This is the true meaning of life is to something that endures forever and never changes. Therefore, the true existence of life only Hashem has. Only the source of life really has life, because the real meaning of life is unchanging life that lasts forever. As the pasuk says, Hashem, who is the God of truth, is the God of life. Truth and life are connected. What's truth mean? Truth is something that never stops, never changes. If it stops, it's called false. And that's why if there's a river that dries up once in 7 years, if it doesn't go on and on, but it dries up once in 7 years, the river is not, you can't take water from that river for the ashes of the paraduma, because it says in the Torah that the ashes of the paraduma must be sprinkled from mayim chaim, from living waters. So if it dries up once in 7 years, it's not called living waters. So Yonatan and Blake are wondering why 7 years? Why is that the thing? I think elsewhere Chassidus says that the 7 years of the river correspond to the let's see, it says in the notes. Oh, note 27, Rebbe Justice. If it dries up in 8 years, it's also a lie. We just said truth is eternal, truth is forever, truth never changes. So why 7? Since the whole existence of the world is falsehood. Why? Because the world only exists for 6,000 years. The world exists for 6,000 years. So the whole existence of the world is false. So when the Torah says living waters, it doesn't mean living waters from the perspective of God's truth. It means living waters from the perspective of the reality of creation. All of creation has a limit to its life. Okay, Chassidus says, just for get a bigger picture of what we're talking about, Chassidus says that when Mashiach comes, the world's not going to be destroyed. As the simple translation of the Gemara, the world will be destroyed after 6,000 years. And the Rambam says that, okay, not getting the whole discussion, but basically, Chassidus says that doesn't mean literally the world will be destroyed. There'll be a new heaven and a new earth. Doesn't mean that it'll be a physically new heaven and physically new earth. It means that because of the revelation of godliness in the world will seem like a brand new world. It will be a brand new world in comparison to the way it is today, even though nothing will really change, as there'll still be the same physical world that we have today, but seeing the goodness and everything will make the world look different. So it says the era of the coming of Mashiach is associated with the 6th millennium. And so this 6 with the 7th millennium, the world exists for 6,000 years, and then the 7th millennium is called destroyed. Doesn't mean it's literally destroyed. It means the opaque physical veneer is destroyed. So when the Torah says that in order for water to be kosher, it has to be living water, it means living water in the realm of creation. Since every 7 years is its independent time period, and therefore, when the waters dry up in more than 7 years, if they last more than 7 years, they're not called a lie from the perspective of creation. They are indeed not truth from the perspective of the real reality, because it stops. But from the perspective of creation, it's called real.
But so 7 is independent existence, you said, because 7,000.
7 is a cycle.
7 is a cycle. So it goes beyond that. Then in the realm of nature, in terms of what's true, then it's eternal. It's eternal in the natural sense, only in the natural sense.
Right. It's eternal from the perspective of creation.
Okay.
Like the famous story of the guy who stayed at the house of the Mzitcha Maggid. He asked Mzitcha Maggid, "How can you live like this?" Mzitcha Maggid says, "What do you mean? You're staying in my house. How did you live like this?" So he said, "I'm just passing through." So Maggid said, "I'm also passing through." So there is a definitely a limitation to the reality of the world, and from the perspective of the reality of the world, this qualifies. There's another opinion which says only if it lasts for 50 years is it considered living waters. The Torah calls the word 50, the number of 50 years, forever. 50 years, not forever. but the Torah describes Yovel as la'olam, as forever. Why is it called forever? It's only 50 years.
Running on 7 sets of sun. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's considered time period. It's considered also a segment of time. Just like Shemitah is considered a segment of time because of the Torah's instruction what to do at the end of 7 years. So to a Yovel, an Eved Knani goes free at the end of 50 years. The land returns at the end of 50 years. So a Yovel is called a period of time, and therefore if it lasts for 70 years, for 50 years, or for 7 years, according to various opinions, then the river can be called true from the perspective of our reality. So where we're going is to explain the meaning of Yaakov's life, that when can we tell that Yaakov is really alive? Only when his life continues, even after his passing, as we shall see Mr. Shem more about that tomorrow. Chazak Baruch. Jonathan, looking great. Love that shirt. Chaim.